Chapter 4, Cells and Energy. So in Chapter 4, we're going to be looking at energy from the standpoint of what is going to be used by the cell, and then what are some of the processes the cells have to go through in order to get that energy. So in 4.1, we're going to start by looking at the molecule that most living things are going to use as their energy carrier molecule. So for us, we'll talk about humans, chemical energy is used for most cell processes is carried by this molecule right here, ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. This is just a molecule. You can think about it like a floating battery. So in your cells, you have thousands upon thousands of this little molecule floating around, waiting to give energy to some other molecule that needs energy for its job. Let's say an enzyme or a protein that needs to change its shape, but it needs energy to do that. Well, an ATP molecule will deliver that energy to the protein or to the enzyme so that it can do its job. So the molecules in food, so the food that you eat, store the chemical energy in the bonds of those molecules. Remember when we talked about carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids and proteins, how those molecules are carbon molecules bonded together to make chains or rings or different structures? Well, the bonds in those molecules are where the energy is stored. So when you eat something and you break it down, you're breaking the bonds of those molecules. That energy that comes out gets stored in this guy. And this is a temporary energy storage molecule. It's quick, it's easy, it's mobile, it's able to be used all over the place, and so it's a very handy little molecule for your cells to take advantage of. Now let's say this ATP goes to an enzyme and gives its energy to that enzyme so that it can break down some other molecule. It does that by breaking this bond right here, the bond between the last two phosphates. This little phosphate chain, the triphosphates, these are where the energy is stored. When this bond is broken and this phosphate goes to the protein or goes to the enzyme, that gives the energy to that enzyme, and that leaves the adenosine triphosphate without its third phosphate. It leaves it in what we call an adenosine diphosphate. Now it only has two. This you consider like a battery that has lost its charge. It needs to go find another phosphate, bond it back on here to become fully charged like this ATP, and then it will go off and deliver that energy to some other molecule. So here's the process of ATP giving its energy away, being a low charge molecule called adenosine diphosphate. Here energy is added back in. It's like getting your batteries recharged. There's that little phosphate that it needed, and it becomes an adenosine triphosphate again. ATP transfers energy from the breakdown of food molecules to cell functions. So we get this energy, we get to build this molecule from the energy stored in the foods that we eat. Energy is released when a phosphate group is removed. So by breaking this one off, I'm able to give this energy to some cell function, and it's added when we put the phosphate back on. So if I take some energy from the breakdown of something that I ate, I can use that energy to store this phosphate back in the chain, and now it's ready to transport that energy someplace else. So sources of ATP are going to be the four biomolecules. Those are the only four things that you can actually consume and get any sort of energy value out of. Carbohydrates are going to be the primary source of energy for humans. Organisms break down carbon-based molecules to produce ATP. Carbohydrates for us are the most important. And the reason is when our body breaks down carbohydrates, we get the most ATP out of it. We generate the most ATP by breaking down this kind of a molecule. So here's a big carbohydrate. This is a starch. It's a whole bunch of little sugars all bonded together to make a big polysaccharide. So when we consume something like this, maybe from a potato or some pasta, when we break these bonds between these little glucose molecules, that breaking of the bond releases energy. That energy is used to pop a phosphate onto an ADP, and we end up getting a load of ATP from this process. So not stored in large amounts, that means the carbohydrates aren't going to be put into long-term storage, but we do get up to 36 ATP from one glucose molecule. So as we break these guys down, we get a lot of ATP molecules out of them. Now when I say not stored in large amounts, let's go to the next slide here. Fats are another thing that you can break down as a source of energy. But for humans, it's not our primary source. And the reason is when our bodies break down fats, the majority of that energy actually gets stored in long-term storage in our fat cells. And that's much more difficult to get that energy back out. Carbohydrates tend to store their energy in the form of ATP, which is very usable, very easily accessed. Now we do get more energy from fats. Look at this list down here. Carbohydrates, from one carbohydrate we can get about 4 calories of energy for each carbohydrate. For lipids we get 9. That's almost more than double the amount of energy, but the problem is that energy is not stored in an easily usable form. It doesn't get stored in ATP, it gets stored in our fat cells, and so fat is a less efficient molecule to use to get ATP. Protein's also not very likely because as we break down protein, we get amino acids. Your body's going to use those amino acids to build itself. And so while we probably in the end get about the same amount of energy out, it's just not stored in the form that our body needs to take advantage of. So carbohydrates are our primary source. Now there are other kinds of energy sources available on the planet. Not every organism has access to sunlight. Some organisms live in places that never get sunlight. So this is an image from the very bottom of the ocean. This thing is called a hydrothermal vent. That means it is a vent of incredibly hot water. It's like a chimney where hot water is spewing out of it. There's a lot of chemicals, a lot of sulfurs and methanes in the environment, and the organisms that live here can use those chemicals as a source of energy to create their ATP. This is called chemosynthesis. This is where chemical energy is going to be used to build the carbon-based molecules. So the process is very similar to what we see with photosynthesis, but there's no light involved. It's just using chemical energy from the environment instead of light energy from the sun. All right, that is the end of 4.1.